This is the third lecture in the course on EU environmental policy and European Green Deal. In the first two lectures, I've been talking about development of EU environmental legislation, then the role of member states, the main EU institutions involved in environmental decision making, and the process of environmental legislation. In this lecture, I will talk about implementation of EU environmental law, monitoring of EU environmental law, and then the European Green Deal itself. Now, starting from monitoring of implementation of EU environmental law, first the question, why do we monitor, why do we assess policy performance? There are several very good reasons. Some of them are listed on this slide by different authors. So the belief that applying analytical tools can lead to more rational policy making. The policy assessment brings scientific evidence to the decision makers. Then it provides crucial insights for learning and developing new policies. So the policy learning aspect is really important here. And then, of course, it ensures responsibility and accountability for actions. For EU and not only the European Union, the timing of assessments of policy implementation is important. EU uses three different phases or stages of policy assessments. It can assess potential future impacts of policies before they are enacted, so the ex ante evaluation. Then ex nunc evaluation, which is performed during policy implementation itself, and then ex post evaluation, which is done later to check whether the impacts and effectiveness of the policy were as it was planned initially. So yes, three different ways, three different timings of the policy assessment which can be conducted. When it comes to policy assessment in the European Union, then indeed I have to remind that monitoring of the implementation of EU legislation by the member states is one of the three central tasks for the European Commission. So legally that's one of their core obligations to check how member states are doing vis-à-vis EU legislation. And there are a lot of civil servants in the European Commission system which have their full-time job to be dealing with policy evaluation, but mostly this work is done by outside consultants because it's cheaper, it's quicker, it's easier for the Commission to manage it this way. So very often policy evaluation is outsourced, or at least the data gathering stage of policy evaluation is outsourced to private consultancy companies to gather the data. So EU spends roughly 50 million euros a day on these assessments by independent experts. So for every regulation or directive which is in place in EU, the European Commission conducts regular monitoring to check whether member states comply with existing legislation, and then secondly, and it's very important, European Commission assesses how successful this EU directive or regulation or other decision has been, how successful this intervention has been. So there is this policy learning aspect clearly here. And if in result of those processes the Commission finds that member state did not fulfill its obligations, it can start what's called infringement procedure or violation procedure against the member state. This violation or infringement procedure starts from European Commission sending a letter to the member state that, look, we see that you've had problems implementing this EU directive or regulation. Could you please explain us? And actually roughly 2/3 of all infringement cases are solved via this first exchange of letters. So member states are able to explain, well, it was misunderstanding, we actually comply with this EU directive, for example, so the case is closed in 2/3 of cases just with this simple exchange of letters. And on this figure you see the total number of this kind of letter exchanges initiated or processes initiated by Commission every year. So you see there are between roughly 500 and 800 such exchanges of letters every year, and these blue parts of the bars show the first phase where EU sent out letter and then member state was able to explain that things are fine, so that the case is closed. So a smaller number of those cases continue through the more formal process between the Commission and member states. Now, when we look at the infringement cases, of course, they are in all policy areas where EU is active, where it has mandate. But what is interesting that environmental cases form the biggest part of infringement cases in the EU. So you see more than 100 infringement cases from 2023 were in field of environment, followed by mobility, by justice, fundamental rights and other issues. But you see environment is the top concern where member states are having difficulties in implementing EU law. And in this black and white graph in left, which is kind of historical data covering the same question roughly 20 years ago, back then the situation was exactly the same. Environment was the field where member states had biggest number of problems fulfilling their promises in implementing EU regulation. Now, when we look at the trend line, then we can see that when it comes to these formal cases of infringement in environmental field, in this graph between 1978 to 2015, then we see that the peak of those problems was in, let's say, early 2000s. So fortunately today we see a bit less problem by member states in fulfilling their promises on environmental matters, but still there are a lot of ongoing cases. Basically the same information on this figure, showing again the number of environmental infringement cases opened, but here the data compares who were the presidents of the European Commission during the times that those environmental infringement cases were launched. So you can see a huge rise in those cases when José Manuel Barroso became president of the European Commission. So over 1,000 such cases opened during his first 5 years as president of the Commission. Now, since then, you see there's a drop of those environmental infringements again. So under Ursula von der Leyen as president of the Commission, a smaller number of infringement cases being opened in the case of environment. But still, those cases are there. You see roughly 100 new cases which European Commission launches against member states or questioning member states every year, and ongoing cases almost 300 according to the latest data. Now when we look inside these environmental cases, we see they're spread across different environmental fields. So you see a lot of cases in the case of water, nature conservation, waste, air protection. So you can't really say that problems are in one single area of environmental protection. No, they are quite evenly distributed. So you see this is not case of one specific policy area or intervention area. Problems are all over the place when it comes to environment. Okay, so European Commission found out that they see that member state doesn't comply with existing environmental regulation, they initiate this process, it may end up in the court. So in these cases, the Court of Justice of the EU is stepping in. And historically, the Court of Justice of the European Union has been influencing EU environmental legislation quite a bit in three different ways. So historically, from the beginning of the EU in 1950s, when environmental protection was still not explicitly a mandate for the EU to be dealing with, then the court very often intervened to find out and say that yes, EU actually can deal with environmental protection because it helps common market. So there had been historically a lot of court cases between member states and the European Commission, and the court very often said that well, environment is not part of EU's core mandate, but it helps to reach common market. So yes, environmental regulations are fully and perfectly legal in EU. So a lot of court cases have been there. Court has been very active on environmental matters. And another important area, there have been a lot of decisions on trade and environment issues. And since 1976, the statistics show that there have been over 700 court rulings on environmental topics. So court being really active in environmental decision-making process in EU. Some of those environmental infringement cases have been lasting really long. On this figure you can see that some of the cases are still ongoing for more than 20 years already. So you see this process can be really complex and really lengthy before a final verdict or final decision is being made. In the worst case for the EU member states, these court cases can end with financial penalties. So on this figure you see the number of those financial penalties with this orange line in the graph, which have been fined by the court. These are not environmental cases, so these are all EU court cases. So you see the number of referrals to the court and the number of financial penalties has been unfortunately increasing in last year, showing that there are more and more cases where court at the end of the day finds that member state didn't comply and they have to pay financial penalty. Now some authors, and this is a figure from an article by Börsel and Busagani from 2019, have also tried to compare different groupings within the European Union. So the original member states, the founding member states, and then northern, southern, eastern member states, what has been the average number of environmental infringements and court cases between EU and its member states. You can't get a clear trend line or clear difference between those subgroupings in the EU. I will end this lecture with the topic of European Green Deal, and I'll divide my slides between two periods. So European Green Deal from 2019 to 24, and then I will end with my kind of predictions and guesses what may happen after 2024 with the Green Deal. I titled this slide Brussels Climate Revolution in 2018 to 2019 because it was an interesting window of opportunity and a lot of things happened in EU system in Brussels with different EU institutions during this quite short time period. So I subjectively chose some events, some dates for this slide. So starting from November 2018, when the European Commission issued its communication, which is kind of early warning or piece of information for other stakeholders on net zero emissions by mid-century, in a document titled A Clean Planet for All. So basically Commission indicating that they want to start a new piece of legislation so that EU can achieve net zero emissions by 2050. Now, following this idea for a new policy, next spring, in March 2019, the outgoing European Parliament made a very ambitious resolution on the same topic. Then, of course, the elections to the new European Parliament took place in spring 2019, and green issues, climate issues were really important topics for discussion during this election period, and there was a very strong mandate for climate and green issues, because green parties and liberal parties were quite successful during this election, so they got more power. Voters clearly said that they want to see more action on environmental and climate issues in the EU. Then, as a result, big negotiations started on the future of European Commission and the future of climate and environmental policy in EU. In June, so right after elections, the Council, the Member States, came together in the format of heads of state to discuss this net zero idea. Initially, 4 countries did not support this idea, but were still not ready to support this idea. So Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary and Estonia at that moment. Then Ursula von der Leyen was nominated as the candidate for the president of the European Commission, and because she immediately saw that her majority in the parliament is very slim, she had to make a lot of promises about what Commission will do in its next 5 years, and to win over the votes of Greens and Left and Liberals as well. She promised that indeed she will create a climate law, so this net zero idea by 2050 will become legal and become law in the EU. She won narrowly this vote in the Parliament, and then the European Council, the heads of member state, then at the end of 2019 voted for this decision on net zero, with only Poland still being the only member state opposing this idea. And then when the new set of college or commissioners of the European Commission started, then the very powerful European politician Frans Timmermans from the Netherlands picked or was offered a post of Commission Vice President to deal with climate. And Frans Timmermans is an outstanding European politician, very well known, very powerful. He could have easily picked any other portfolios in the Commission, but I think the very sign that he started dealing with climate policy was very powerful, showing that this clearly is a priority and this issue will be taken really seriously by the next Commission. So yes, 3 vice presidents, and then Frans Timmermans from the Netherlands dealing with European Green Deal and climate issues in the Commission from 2019 till 2024. The European Green Deal is a very complex issue and complex package, and people very often confuse between different initiatives and documents. Fully understandable, this is difficult. So on this slide I put these things very simple. So European Green Deal was one of 6 policy priorities for 2019-2024 European Commission. So to quote this document, the idea was to transform EU into a modern, resource-efficient and competitive economy, ensuring no net emissions of greenhouse gases by 2050, and secondly, economic growth decoupled from resource use, and no person and no place left behind. So a general policy direction, one of the 6 Commission priorities for next 5 years. Now, to implement this long-term goal, European climate law, actually a regulation, was made and agreed and adopted in 2021 to balance greenhouse gas emissions and absorption by 2050, so reaching net zero. And then it had a midterm goal for 2030 to reduce EU CO2 emissions by 55% compared to 1990. And now to really implement this ambitious goal of the European Green Deal on climate neutrality and the new European climate law, a package called Fit for 55 was put together to implement all this, and it consists actually of 13 different legal acts, whether completely new EU directives or in most cases revisions of already existing directives or regulations in many different fields to make sure that this ambitious goal of the Commission will be implemented by the Member States. So yes, as I said, 13 different legal acts ranging from emissions trading system to revision of regulation on emissions and removals from land use, change and forestry, so the famous LULUCF regulation, effort sharing between member states, carbon border tax, tightening of CO2 emission performance standards for cars and vans, decisions about aviation, marine fuels, alternative fuel, infrastructure, renewable energy, energy efficiency, energy taxation, energy performance of buildings, and then last but not least the new social climate fund of the EU, where so far 87 billion euros has been set aside to alleviate energy and transport poverty. So 13 different legal acts adopted or created in EU to make sure that European Green Deal will be implemented. And then to make sure there is enough money for that, there were separate decisions on how to allocate enough funds for this. A new fund was created, Just Transition Fund, but also other funding mechanisms outside direct environmental or climate field, dealing with infrastructure, agriculture, economic recovery. Also they got their targets that part of money from those funds also has to support European Union's climate ambitions. Now, as a result of this, all these legal changes which were done during a few last years, what may happen in some of the policy areas in the European Union. So I selected few policy areas to give just example what European Green Deal may mean in practice for all of us here in European Union. And I built my slides in a way that in the red text I indicate some of the current challenges in the EU, and then in the green in the bottom what have been decided so far in the EU, how to tackle some of these problems. So I start from the nature and land use, and there's a lot of problems indeed with it at the moment. For example, 81% of habitats are in bad or poor condition in the EU. A lot of species are in unfavorable condition, be it fishes, amphibians, non-vascular plants and many others. So a lot of problems with nature and land use in the EU. Now, what has been agreed as part of nature restoration regulation, I will not read through all this, but you see there's talk about at least 20% of EU's land and sea areas to be restored by 2030. There is talk about removing of artificial barriers like dikes and dams on 25,000 kilometers of European rivers. There's a decision that by 2030 we need to improve pollinator diversity and reverse the decline of pollinator population in EU. there are decisions about peat extraction, about planting at least 3 billion trees in EU, so a lot of plans out there. When it comes to forests, forestry policy is something which EU has not been really historically regulating, so not a lot of action in European forests, kind of regulated centrally by the European Union, but still there have been some rules and guidances and strategies existing in EU. Now, what are some of the new ideas coming from the European Green Deal which will affect European forestry sector? First and perhaps most importantly, it has been decided that additional 310 million tons of carbon dioxide emissions must be stored in carbon sinks, which mostly means forests, by 2030. And this will only be realistically possible with a lot of reforestation and afforestation in European Union. So a big challenge ahead of us for sure. And then in the Nature Restoration Regulation there is a specific paragraph stating that member states shall achieve at least an increasing trend at national level of at least 6 out of 7 different indicators when it comes to forest ecosystems. Again, they're all listed on these slides, and there has been a separate decision about products which are imported to the European Union and saying that those products can't originate from recently deforested land nor have contributed to forest degradation in forests outside the European Union, so impact beyond the borders of the European Union clearly. Next topic, agriculture. Again, lots of challenges across the European Union. Agricultural soils are increasingly depleted. There is decline in pollinators, grassland butterflies, farmland birds abundance, so a lot of problems related to agriculture. Now again, as part of Nature Restoration Regulation, which was recently adopted, there are several targets set for agricultural activities in the EU. Again, the same formula as with the forest regulations. It tells that member states shall achieve an increasing trend in at least 2 out of these 3 indicators, so grassland butterfly index, stock of organic carbon in cropland mineral soils, and then share of agricultural land with high diversity landscape features, and a specific index on common farmland birds. Now, unfortunately, when talking about agriculture and the future ambitious goals for the EU, there were a lot of original goals which European Commission proposed to be part of the Nature Restoration Regulation. It was heavily discussed, of course, across EU. And unfortunately, a lot of original goals were abandoned in the process of drafting and discussing this piece of legislation, and this was clearly a concerted effort by European farming lobby and European People's Party, the Conservative Party in the European Parliament, which unfortunately for this case is the biggest political party in the European Parliament. So the Farm to Fork Strategy, Framework for Sustainable Food Systems, Regulation on the Sustainable Use of Plant Protection Products, they were all either abandoned or weakened. So these 3 cases I list here were actually deleted from the original proposal, which is very sad, of course, for EU's environmental policy. So the idea about 25% of agricultural land being there for organic farming, this idea was deleted. The proposal to reduce nutrient loss and the reduced use of fertilizers, it was deleted from the proposal, and also the text about reduced use of chemical and hazardous pesticides in EU. So at the end of another very complex, preheated debate in EU. Unfortunately, these targets didn't make it into the law in EU. Now when I come to built up areas or cities, again, we see a lot of challenges in the EU currently. For example, 75% of buildings are wasting energy. Buildings are huge energy consumers. Indeed, they emit a lot of greenhouse gases into atmosphere. Green areas in our cities are shrinking. And we have seen recently a lot of deaths due to heat waves in Europe, and of course built up areas and areas covered by stone or asphalt are extremely dangerous during these heat waves. Now, what are some of the goals that EU has agreed as part of European Green Deal and as part of Europe Energy Performance Buildings Directive, which was adopted in 2024? First, from 2030 all new buildings must have zero emissions. Second, in each member state 15% of the most energy wasting buildings should be renovated. And then by 2050 we shall reconstruct the entire EU building stock to at least Class C in this classification. So a huge task ahead of us when it comes to cities. Then also, as part of nature restoration regulation, there has been decision that by 2030 there should be no net loss of total national area of urban green space and of urban tree canopy cover in urban ecosystems compared to 2024. And there should be an increasing trend in the total national area of urban green space in member states. Now again, unfortunately, there were two original ideas or targets which were deleted from nature restoration regulation, which would have positively influenced the greenery in the cities. So the initial idea of increasing this green area space in cities was killed from this legislative proposal. And then also another idea about increase of tree canopy cover. Now I come to the waste or recycling issue. Of course, again, a lot of challenges. What we see today, too much waste still being generated, too much landfilling still being around, too little reuse, too little recycling of resources and waste. Now again, a lot of things were agreed as part of European Green Deal, a lot of decisions and new targets on the rate of recycling, of municipal waste, packaging waste, decrease of landfilling of municipal waste, ban on use of certain single-use plastics, again recycling rates for plastic bottles. So a lot of details that you can find in those decisions. We'll see how they will be implemented in reality. When it comes to transport, again, a lot of well-known challenges and environmental problems and concerns. In EU, greenhouse gas emissions are still growing in transport sector. That's the only sector of economy in EU where greenhouse gas emissions are still growing, so a big concern indeed. Car ownership is increasing, quick expansion of aviation and aviation emissions increasing as well. So again, as part of European Green Deal and many changes in existing directives in EU, there have been new targets set. One of them, reduction of transport sector emissions by 90% by 2050. Then the ban on the sale of so-called fossil cars, or cars which are run on gasoline or diesel in 2035. Then decision about alternative fuel infrastructure on main roads, so talking about charging points for electric cars or hydrogen cars. Now I come to energy sector. Again, EU countries historically have been one of the biggest sources or emitters of greenhouse gases globally. So we have our ethical questions there as well. And still, we are emitting quite a bit of greenhouse gases, although the emissions are coming down. Again, several decisions have been made as part of European Green Deal. So indeed, European Union has its ambitious target of reaching net zero emissions by 2050, including reducing emissions by 55% by 2030 already, and achieving a share of renewable energy of ideally 45% by 2030. And there is another target on additional energy saving by member states by 2030. This is all what has been already decided by EU institutions, so Commission, Parliament, Council. These percentages, targets, figures which I showed are already in place. So this is what's waiting ahead. Now, what may be the future of European Green Deal? Indeed, we had new elections to the European Parliament in 2024. The new European Commission will start under Ursula von der Leyen and will be working in the next 5 years till 2029. I made a comparison in this table about European Commission's priorities for its next 5 years in office, and you can see visually on this table in the left Commission priorities for 19 to 24. European Green Deal indeed was one of the 6 priorities, but whenever Commission showed their priorities, European Green Deal always was listed as the first one in this list. Of course, being equally important to the other ones, but visually it always came first. Commission was very proud of this initiative. Now, when we look at next 5 years, what may happen is that again you have a list of 6 priorities, but you see the topic of water and nature being mentioned on the quality of life, but as priority number 4. Although, of course, they're not ranked, but already visually you can see that perhaps environmental and climate issues have dropped a bit in the list of priorities for the Commission. When you look at the Council, so the member states of the European Union, they also agreed their strategic agenda for 2024-29. So there are 3 clusters of priorities for the member states in EU, and you see again green or environment or climate issues come only under the 3rd group of priorities, being titled Making a Success of the Green and Digital Transition. So transition being the key term here, not environment or climate change, for example. What it all may mean for environment and EU environmental decision making in next 5 years, of course, first, nobody knows. It's a prediction about what may happen in future. It all can go completely different way. What's clear from the speeches of Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and other commissioners is that European Green Deal will be continued, indeed, because it's all already in EU legislation. What may happen, hopefully not, but what may happen is that there will be attempts to weaken European Green Deal, so some of these already agreed targets may be weakened by the member states, and we have already seen first signs of this potential. So there are a lot of ideas now floating around about softening existing rules for car CO2 emissions, for example. But we'll see. What may happen is general weakening of environmental regulation because there is push for simplification of EU rules. And historically, we have seen that when somebody starts talking about simplification of rules, it may bring bad news for environment, maybe for social protection as well. So we will see if that simplification will bring with it some demolition or weakening of environmental standards in EU. There is clearly push for nuclear energy. There is talk about accelerating deployment of small modular reactors in EU. Of course, that's a reactor type which doesn't really exist in the world until now, but Commission is very optimistic about it, so we will see more nuclear power perhaps in future in EU. And there is talk about climate engineering in these new ideas of the new Commission going into future, so talk about carbon capture and storage, again a technology which exists in pilot level but not in massive scale economically at the moment in the market conditions, but we'll see. Then I'd say quite dangerous ideas are floating around already when it comes to safety of chemicals. So the EU landmark REACH chemical regulation is to be simplified. What that will bring and mean, nobody knows yet, but potentially it may mean weakening of some standards and potential threat to public health in EU. There's also already a talk about providing clarity on the planned phase out of so-called forever chemicals in EU. What that provision of more clarity mean, again, nobody knows yet, but a very dangerous sign, I guess. Another idea or concern being already floated by many is that we may face a situation where life financial programs, a specific huge financial scheme for nature conservation and environment and climate projects in EU maybe reduced. We'll see. Again, nothing in the papers yet, but this threat has been already underlined by many people. So this was the third lecture in this course on EU environmental policy and European Green Deal. I hope you enjoyed it. Any questions, just write me.